What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple chat, only to face the most shocking disrespect ever caught on live television? In just 37 seconds, a single comment would expose the true character of a beloved talk show host and leave audiences gasping at the ugly truth behind the polished smile. Graham Norton leaned back in his signature red chair, that familiar smirk playing across his lips as he gestured toward his guest. The studio audience was still settling from their applause as Denzel Washington adjusted his position on the sofa, clearly expecting the usual lighthearted banter that made this show famous worldwide. "So Denzel," Graham began, his Irish accent thick with what seemed like genuine warmth, "you've been making films for what, 40 years now? Must be nice to finally get some recognition." The comment hung in the air like smoke. Denzel's eyebrows raised slightly, but his voice remained measured. "Well, Graham, I've been blessed to work in this industry for a long time. Yes, the recognition has been there from early on, thankfully." Graham's laugh was sharp, cutting through the studio like broken glass. "Oh, come on now, let's be honest. Before Training Day, you were just another pretty face doing the same role over and over. Malcolm X, Hurricane, all those serious dramas where you play the noble suffering man. Bit repetitive, wouldn't you say?" The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the Graham Norton they knew. Denzel remained composed, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "I think each of those characters brought something different to explore. Malcolm X was about transformation and faith. Reuben Carter in Hurricane was about injustice and perseverance. These are important stories that needed to be told." "Important stories," Graham repeated, air quotes forming around his fingers in a gesture so condescending it made several audience members gasp. Right. The noble Denzel Washington, savior of cinema, teaching us all about the struggles of being black in America. Tell me, don't you ever get tired of being so? How do I put this delicately? Preachy. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Denzel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice stayed level. "Graham, I think you might be misunderstanding what those films were about. They weren't preachy. They were human stories about real people who faced real challenges." "Oh, please." Graham waved his hand dismissively. "Spare me the lecture. You've built your entire career on playing the same character, the angry black man who overcomes adversity through sheer determination and moral superiority. It's Oscar bait, pure and simple." The studio fell silent. Even the camera seemed to freeze as the weight of Graham's words settled over everyone present. Denzel slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the host's face. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Graham, oblivious to the gravity of what he'd just uttered, actually chuckled. "I said you play the same character, the angry black man template." "Come on, Denzel, surely you can see the pattern. Flight was different, I'll give you that. But even then, you managed to find a way to make it about suffering and redemption." "The angry black man template," Denzel repeated slowly, each word carefully measured. "Is that really how you see my work?" "Well, yes, if we're being honest here. Look at your filmography. It's all there. The righteous anger, the moral speeches, the inevitable triumph over prejudice or corruption. It's formulaic." Denzel sat back, his expression unreadable. "Graham, I've portrayed fathers, pilots, coaches, detectives, soldiers, historical figures. Each one was a human being with their own story, their own struggles, their own victories. If you see them all as the same person, I think that says more about how you're choosing to look at them than it does about my performances." Graham's smirk widened, and he leaned forward conspiratorially toward the audience. "Oh, he's good, isn't he? See how smoothly he turns it back on me? That's exactly the kind of performance I'm talking about. The dignified response to ignorance, the measured tone, the subtle moral superiority. It's all very impressive, but we've seen it before." The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. They were witnessing something unprecedented. Several people in the front row looked genuinely shocked, their mouths hanging open. Others were looking toward the exit, as if they weren't sure they should be witnessing this train wreck. Denzel's voice, when he spoke again, carried a different quality. Still controlled, still dignified, but now with an edge of steel that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "Graham, I came here tonight as your guest. I expected to have a conversation about my work, maybe share some stories with your audience. What I didn't expect was to be reduced to a racial stereotype by someone who's supposed to be a professional." "Racial stereotype?" Graham laughed, but there was nervousness creeping into it now. "I never mentioned race. I was talking about your acting choices. Don't put words in my mouth. You literally just called it the angry black man template, Denzel said quietly. Those were your exact words. Graham's face flushed slightly, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. Fine, yes, I said that, but I was describing a type of character, not making a racial statement. There's a difference. Is there? Denzel asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've looked at 40 years of my career and decided that every character I've played fits into one little box that makes you comfortable. The angry black man who learns his place and makes everyone feel good about themselves. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. Graham was starting to realize he might be in deeper water than he'd intended, but his ego wouldn't let him retreat. Now you're being dramatic, he said, waving his hand again. I'm just saying your roles follow a pattern. Most actors do. Tom Hanks plays the everyman. Will Smith plays the charming hero. You play the dignified fighter. It's not personal. Denzel stood up slowly, his 6'1" frame unfolding from the sofa with deliberate grace. The movement was so unexpected that several audience members gasped audibly. Actually, Graham, it is personal. It's very personal. When you reduce decades of my work, my craft, my dedication to telling meaningful stories down to a stereotype that makes you comfortable, that's personal. When you sit there with that smug smile and tell me that Malcolm X and Reuben Carter and Troy Maxson are all the same character, that's not criticism. That's ignorance. Graham's smile was fading fast now, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Denzel, please, sit down. Let's talk about this like civilized people. Civilized? Denzel's voice rose for the first time, and the power behind it made the entire studio vibrate. You want to talk about civilized? Was it civilized when you decided to ambush me with your narrow-minded opinions? Was it civilized when you reduced my life's work to a racial caricature? The host's face was now completely red, and sweat was beginning to show on his forehead under the studio lights. I think you're overreacting. This is just a conversation between colleagues. Colleagues? Denzel shook his head slowly. Graham, we are not colleagues. I'm an actor who spent 4 decades perfecting his craft. You're a talk show host who thinks clever insults make up for genuine insight. Graham's attempt at damage control was pathetic to watch. He forced out a laugh that sounded more like a wounded animal than genuine humor. Oh, come now, Denzel. Don't be so sensitive. This is what we do here. We have honest conversations. We poke fun. It's all in good spirit. Good spirit? Denzel's voice carried a dangerous calm that made everyone in the studio lean forward. Tell me, Graham, when was the last time you told a white actor that they built their career on playing the same stereotype? When did you last reduce Meryl Streep's performances to the suffering white woman template? Or tell Robert De Niro he only plays angry Italian men? The silence that followed was deafening. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking like a fish gasping for air. The audience could sense they were witnessing something historic, something that would be talked about for years. That's different, Graham stammered, his usual confidence completely evaporated. Those actors have more range. More range? Denzel stepped closer to Graham's chair, and the host actually flinched. I've played a lawyer, a coach, a pilot with addiction issues, a working-class father trying to provide for his family, a corrupt cop, a subway dispatcher, a safe house operative, a bounty hunter, a preacher, a soldier. But somehow, in your mind, they're all the same person, because they happen to be played by a black man. Graham was sweating profusely now, his famous wit nowhere to be found. I never said anything about race being the issue. You're putting words in my mouth. Am I? Denzel's voice rose again, and this time there was no containing the power behind it. Then explain to me how you see a pattern in my work that apparently doesn't exist in the work of white actors who've played similar roles. Explain to me how my portrayal of historical figures and fictional characters all somehow blend together in your mind into one convenient stereotype. The studio cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of Graham's complete meltdown. His face had gone from red to pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. Look, maybe I misspoke, he said, his Irish accent now trembling with barely controlled panic. Maybe I didn't express myself clearly. Oh, you expressed yourself perfectly clearly, Denzel shot back. You looked at 4 decades of my career and saw exactly what you wanted to see. Not the hours of preparation for each role. Not the research into each character's background. Not the emotional investment in telling their stories truthfully. You saw a black actor playing black characters, and that was enough for you to dismiss everything else. Graham tried to regain some control, straightening in his chair and attempting his trademark smirk. You know what, Denzel? maybe you're right. Maybe I do see patterns, but that's because they're there. You can dress it up with all the fancy words you want about craft and dedication, but at the end of the day, you've made a very comfortable living playing the same type of role over and over again. The gasp from the audience was audible. Several people actually stood up, as if they were preparing to leave. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a character assassination happening in real time. Denzel stared at Graham for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone in the studio had to strain to hear him. The same type of role, he repeated slowly. Graham, let me ask you something. What do you think Malcolm X, Reuben Carter, Troy Maxon, and Frank Lucas have in common besides the color of their skin? Graham, emboldened by what he mistook for Denzel backing down, actually smiled. They're all angry men fighting against a system that's keeping them down. They're all righteous in their own minds. They all make speeches about justice and doing the right thing. Malcolm X was a civil rights leader who transformed from a street criminal to one of the most important voices in American history. Reuben Carter was a boxer wrongly imprisoned for murder who maintained his dignity through decades of injustice. Troy Maxon was a sanitation worker struggling with his own demons while trying to provide for his family. Frank Lucas was a drug dealer who destroyed communities for profit. Denzel's voice grew stronger with each character description. If you think those are the same person, then you weren't watching the films. You were watching your own prejudices projected onto the screen. Graham's smile faltered, but his ego wouldn't let him concede. Fine, they're different people, but you play them all the same way, with that same intensity, that same moral authority, that same, he paused, searching for words, that same black anger. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Even Graham seemed to realize he'd gone too far this time, but it was too late. The damage was done. Denzel nodded slowly, as if Graham had just confirmed everything he'd suspected. Black anger. There at Island. The real truth behind your criticism. It's not about my acting. It's not about repetitive roles or lack of range. It's about the fact that you see a black man expressing any emotion with conviction, and you label it as anger. You see a black man standing up for principles, and you call it righteousness. You see a black man telling stories about the black experience, and you dismiss it as preaching. That's not what I meant, Graham protested weakly, but everyone in the studio could see he was lying. No, Graham, that's exactly what you meant. And you know what the truly sad part is? You probably don't even realize how deep your prejudice runs. You probably think you're being fair and objective. You probably tell yourself that you judge all actors equally. Denzel shook his head in disgust. But when you reduce my entire career to black anger and then try to pretend it's not about race, you're not fooling anyone except yourself. Graham was now visibly desperate, looking around the studio as if searching for help that wasn't coming. I think we should take a break, he said weakly. Clear the air, start fresh. Clear the air? Denzel laughed, but there was no humor in it. Graham, you just spent the last 10 minutes demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that makes it hard for actors who look like me to get complex, nuanced roles. You've shown everyone watching exactly how certain people in this industry really think about black performers. And now you want to take a break and pretend it didn't happen? The host was completely out of his depth now, his famous quick wit replaced by stammering desperation. I never meant to offend you. This is just how we do things here. We joke around. We push boundaries. It's not personal. Everything about this has been personal, Graham. From the moment you decided that my 4 decades of work could be dismissed as formula, it became personal. When you reduce characters I spent months preparing for down to stereotypes, it became personal. And when you sat there with that smug smile and told me I was being too sensitive for calling out your ignorance, it became very personal. Graham's desperation was now complete. Sweat was pouring down his face under the studio lights, and his voice cracked as he made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation. Denzel, please, you're a guest on my show. Can't we just agree to disagree and move on? Talk about your new project? The audacity of the request hit the studio like a physical blow. After everything that had been said, after every insult and stereotype, Graham Norton actually thought he could just wave it all away and continue with the interview as if nothing had happened. Denzel stared at him for a long moment, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like pity. Move on, he said quietly. Graham, do you have any idea what you just did? Do you understand what just happened here? We had a disagreement about your acting style, Graham said weakly, still trying to minimize the damage. It's not the end of the world. No, Graham, what happened here is that you revealed who you really are. Behind all the charm and wit and Irish humor, You showed everyone watching exactly how you see people like me. Not as individuals, not as artists, not as human beings with complex stories to tell. You see us as types, as categories, as convenient boxes that make you comfortable. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some were recording with their phones, knowing they were witnessing television history. Others looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. Graham made one final attempt to regain control. You know what, Denzel? Maybe you're right. Maybe I do see patterns in your work. But that doesn't make me racist. That makes me a critic. And if you can't handle criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. The words were barely out of his mouth before he realized his mistake. The studio audience actually groaned audibly. Even his own production crew was shaking their heads in disbelief. Graham Norton had just told one of the most respected actors in Hollywood that he couldn't handle criticism. Denzel's response was swift and devastating. Criticism? His voice rose to fill every corner of the studio. Graham, you want to know what real criticism sounds like? Real criticism examines performance choices. Real criticism discusses character development, directorial decisions, script quality. Real criticism doesn't reduce 40 years of work to a racial stereotype and then hide behind the word honesty when called out. He began pacing now, his movements controlled but filled with barely contained energy. You want criticism? Let's talk about criticism. Your show has been on the air for decades, and your entire style is based on making guests uncomfortable for cheap laughs. You hide behind alcohol and innuendo because you lack the skill to have genuine conversations about art or craft or the human condition. Graham's mouth fell open, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he was completely speechless. You sit in that red chair night after night, interviewing people who have dedicated their lives to their craft, and you reduce them to punchlines and stereotypes because actual insight requires work. It requires research. It requires empathy. And judging from tonight's performance, those are qualities you simply don't possess. The host's face was now completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. Denzel stopped pacing and faced him directly. But here's the really sad part, Graham. You probably think you're the victim in all of this. You probably think I'm the one being unreasonable. You probably think that calling out your prejudice makes me the angry black man you've been talking about all evening. I never called you angry, Graham whispered, his voice barely audible. You didn't have to. It was in every word you spoke, every dismissive gesture you made, every smug smile you flashed at the audience when you thought you were being clever. You looked at me and saw exactly what you expected to see. And when I didn't play along with your little game, when I refused to laugh at your insults and pretend they were jokes, you decided I was being too sensitive. Denzel walked over to where his jacket was draped over the back of the sofa and picked it up with deliberate calm. You know what, Graham? You're absolutely right about one thing. I do play characters who fight against systems that try to keep them down. I do portray men who stand up for their principles, even when it's difficult. I do tell stories about people who refuse to accept injustice quietly. He slipped his arms into his jacket, his movements precise and controlled. And if that makes me the angry black man in your narrow little world, then I'll wear that label proudly, because at least those characters have integrity. They have dignity. They stand for something bigger than themselves. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed deafeningly loud. Graham sat frozen in his chair, looking like a deer caught in headlights. But you know what you'll never understand, Graham? Those characters aren't angry for the sake of being angry. They're angry because they see injustice, and they refuse to accept it. They're angry because they know the world can be better than an island. They're angry because they care about something more than their own comfort. Denzel buttoned his jacket with the same careful precision he brought to every role he'd ever played. That's the difference between us, Graham. My characters fight for justice, for truth, for their families, for their communities. What do you fight for? What do you stand for? Besides the right to insult your guests and call it entertainment? Graham tried one last time to respond, his voice coming out as little more than a croak. Denzel, please don't leave like this. We can work this out. Denzel looked at him with something that might have been pity. Work it out? Graham, you can't work out 40 years of thinking. You can't fix a mindset that sees every black actor as the same person. You can't repair the damage you did here tonight with a simple apology or a clever joke. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. Just before reaching the door, he turned back to face Graham one final time. You asked me earlier if I ever get tired of being preachy. Let me answer that question now. I get tired of having to explain why dignity matters. I get tired of having to justify my choices to people who see the world through the lens of their own limitations. I get tired of being reduced to a stereotype by people who wouldn't recognize good acting if it bit them on the backside. His voice grew stronger, filling the studio one last time. But I never get tired of standing up for what's right. I never get tired of fighting against ignorance and prejudice, whether it comes from a street corner or a television studio. And I never, ever get tired of walking away from people who don't have the basic respect to see me as a human being first and a black actor second. With that, Denzel Washington turned and walked out of the studio, leaving Graham Norton sitting alone in his red chair, surrounded by a stunned audience and a crew that couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Graham finally found his voice, weak and shaking. "Well," he said to the cameras, "I think that's all we have time for tonight." But everyone knew it was much more than that. It was the end of an era, the moment when one man's dignity triumphed over another man's prejudice, broadcast live for the world to see.